So my contention is that we're always talking about fintech or medtech, but the most important tech is Psych-Tech. And the reason Psych-Tech is the most important tech is that Psych-Tech satisfies, it doesn't pave the cow paths. It doesn't take what an existing category like financial services used to do and just jazz up the efficiencies. It doesn't do the same thing in a more efficient way. And that's called paving the cow paths, by analogy with the city of Boston, which effectively paved the existing windy road network rather than thinking of redesigning the roads. Okay. So it didn't really change fundamentally the network of roads in Boston. It just put, now, to be honest, as a Brit, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing to do, because the windy roads often carry information about human behavior that is lost when people install a grid plan. I think New York suffers from a grid plan, by the way. Chicago doesn't. I don't know why I'm going into a sudden digression into city design. Chicago has the very clever idea where behind every building, there's a secondary grid for the delivery of goods and the removal of garbage. So Chicago looks like a very neat city because all the dirty stuff is happening out of sight. Whereas in New York, you can't really have a cafe on the pavement in New York, because next door to you, you'll have a massive garbage truck or some enormous bit of heavy machinery being delivered to the office. Whereas in Chicago, all that happens rather like it does in Disney. It happens behind the scenes, okay? Chicago is a much better designed city than New York. And also, I don't know if you noticed this, but unlike New York, it doesn't smell of urine. So I just thought I'd just make that point I always notice New Yorkers don't seem to notice that their city smells of piss. You notice that? Anyway, I don't know what that's all about, but I just thought I'd raise that. I'm a huge Chicago fan. If ever you get a chance to go to Chicago, go there. It's in a sense, it's a glorious, glorious city. Anyway, Psych-Tech is tech that doesn't confine itself to a particular category of activity. It defines itself around the real why of human need, the things that people really need, that they often don't think about and don't talk about because they're unconscious needs. And often they're unmet needs precisely because they're unconscious, because companies using research won't hear about them, okay? Economics won't talk about them because economics doesn't understand them. So unless you have behavioral science, you won't understand the real why of human behavior. And Psych-Tech is tech that's designed to satisfy that why, okay? And so if I move on, that's what Psych-Tech is. I would argue that the other reason we need Psych-Tech is that most of the developed world's problems are effectively marketing problems in disguise. It's not that solar panels need to be cheaper. It's not that they need to be more efficient. They're already good enough. The problem is that people won't put them on the goddamn roof. And part of the reason they won't put them on the goddamn roof is that the way in which they're described uses metrics that you need a degree in electrical engineering to understand them. If you simply said to me, spend £1,000, it'll cut your electricity bill by 10%. I look at that and say, that's a 10% return on investment. That's better than anything I can get in any savings plan that anybody's legally offering me, okay? Instead, they start talking about, wattage and bloody weird shit like that, which nobody understands, okay? In the same way that it's a kind of disaster that electric cars started getting, defined so much around range, because 99% of the time, what you needed to solve the electric car problem wasn't actually necessarily battery life, although that will come. It was an insurance product that allowed you to swap your Tesla with a petrol car, with a friend's petrol car for the 3 days a year you're actually driving over 300 miles. Okay? I've got friends with exotic cars. If I said to them, would you like to borrow my Tesla for 3 days if I can have your Volvo XC90? No one's going to say no. What you probably needed for electric cars was an insurance product. You didn't actually need a battery product. So a lot of problems are really marketing problems in disguise. And the other problem we have is that one of the greatest biases of human behavior. Now, this sentence, I think we might have co-created it, but it certainly originates with Chris Graves, my colleague in New York. Just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's true. And what we're liable to do when presented with statistics, and I think Zamo will really appreciate this, is we look for the first theory that makes sense of them, logically, makes sense of our findings, and then we stop looking, okay? Why do people clean their teeth? Well, if you're not interested in the real why, you just go, people clean their teeth to maintain gum health, dental hygiene, and prevent cavities and decay, okay? And for the removal of plaque. Let's look at when people clean their teeth. They clean their teeth first thing in the morning. They clean their teeth before they go to work. I'll be absolutely honest with you. You don't want to know this, but I'm doing a video call this morning, so I haven't got around to cleaning my teeth yet because it's a video call. If I were meeting you, I would have spent a good minute and a half scrubbing at my teeth with vigorous effort, okay? Why? Because the real why we clean our teeth is fear of bad breath, not long-term dental health. It's a short-term Darwinian motivation trumps the long-term rational motivation, or you could argue complements it, because actually 99%, first of all, we don't clean our teeth. We clean our teeth before a date. We clean our teeth before we go out to a nightclub. We clean our teeth before we go to work. Do we clean our teeth after lunch? Nah, not very much indeed. Not very much at all. Do we always clean our teeth at the weekend if we're at home alone? We probably don't, to be absolutely honest, okay? And so the use of toothpaste, it correlates much more closely with women's use of cosmetics. In other words, it's something you use before emerging into a public setting, okay? By the way, I think this is really politically incorrect. I think Islam's got this right, by the way, which is that in Islam, women dress modestly outside the house, but they dress alluringly at home, which, if you think about it from a man's point of view, in the West, women get dressed up to go out, but then when they go home, they sit around in a t-shirt and a pair of sloggy pants, right? I don't want to be rude, but Islamic males definitely get the right end of the deal here, don't they, in terms of marital fidelity? Okay. Now, anyway, I'll park that one, but I'll just make the point that that isn't necessarily irrational. It all depends on your point of view, right? Okay, cheeky. I'm going to lose my job now, but there we go. Okay. Now, but just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's true. And so if people say, I clean my teeth to maintain dental health, and it seems like a rational, you go, I see. So the utility you derive from toothpaste is long-term dental health. We don't bother digging any deeper because we have now this, I think, comes from the evolutionary origins of the human brain, which is the human brain, the conscious reasoning part of the human brain evolved because we're a social species, and it evolved for us to explain and defend our behavior to others and to argue with others and to win arguments, not for its contribution to our actual decision-making. Most all other animals on the planet manage to survive perfectly well in evolutionary terms without needing a faculty of reason, okay? So in many ways, the human brain, the conscious part of the human brain has the mentality of a lawyer. It's trying to construct a defense case. It's not trying to get at the truth, okay? Now, if I'd been advising, we had a scandal where a government advisor called Dominic Cummings claimed that he went for a drive during the COVID lockdown because he wanted to test his eyesight before he drove back to London a day later. I think he was telling the truth, by the way, because I don't think it was a very convincing reason. If he'd rang me up and said, I need a convincing reason for why I went for a drive, I would have said, you've been ill with COVID for 12 days, okay? You drive a Land Rover. Anybody who's had a JLR, Jaguar Land Rover vehicle knows that if you leave them for about 3 weeks, the battery goes flat. I would have said you needed to charge your battery up with a short drive before you embarked on the long journey back to London. And therefore you had to go on a bit of a long drive to charge your battery. But because he came up with a reason which may well have been his true reason, nobody thought it very convincing. And so there are convincing reasons and there are true reasons, and we don't really differentiate between the two. We bias our search to convincing reasons, not true reasons, okay? Because we're lawyers, we're not philosophers, okay? We've evolved to be lawyers first and philosophers second and psychologists third, because we don't, for very many evolutionary reasons, evolution doesn't want us to have deep introspective knowledge into our own primary motivations because we give the game away. Okay? It doesn't want us to. If you went out on a date, right, and you met a girl you found very attractive. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second here love doesn't exist. It's very real. It's evolved for a reason. But part of the purpose of love is to disguise lust, okay? Right? Because it is much more successful as an evolutionary strategy to say, I'm really pleased to hear you're interested in 17th century French poetry. I think I'm quoting from Groundhog Day there, aren't I? You know, where she said, I studied 17th century French poetry, and he goes, "Pah!" Okay, right. And the second time he meets, he actually starts quoting from some bizarre medieval French poet. Okay. Now, the reason is that it's much more effective when we meet people to actually, what you might say is that the proximate motivation is to actually establish, you know, deeper relations with someone. And it's better at solving the problem obliquely than it is trying to solve the problem directly. Because going whoa when you meet someone isn't very good as a reproductive strategy, okay? Whereas quoting a 17th century French poet is probably much more effective. So there are problems we have to solve obliquely, okay? There are problems when there's a degree of information asymmetry, where there's a degree of game theory involved, where the only way to solve the problem is to actually have a kind of oblique motivation. And the oblique motivation requires our ultimate motivation to be buried. And that's why, as I said, we're lawyers first, philosophers second, and psychologists third. And so the real why, if I want to prove my point, 99% of the world's toothpaste is flavored with mint. Now, if the real reason were dental health, that wouldn't be the case, would it? I don't even like the taste of mint very much, okay? But toothpaste, even if you use a brand called Euthymol, which is not flavored with mint, it has a very weird medicinal taste. It has to have that weird, slightly stingy, weirdy, kind of cooly, strange chemical taste to reassure us that our breath is fresh, because that's the ultimate motivation. But the official reason is all about dental health. And that's my great point, which is Chris Graves's quote is one of the most important sentences in understanding decision science, which is just because something makes sense doesn't mean it's true. Another thing that will surprise you is marketing and innovation are fundamentally the same thing. That they're, okay, if I were to, Steve Jobs, Thomas Alva Edison, okay, even the people like Swan, who are the British light bulb inventors, they were showmen. They were P.T. Barnum with goods, okay? That actually innovation requires behavioral change and attitudinal change. It doesn't simply require a new product to come along. There is always a marketing component to any problem of innovation that requires human willingness to change behavior. And when you think about it, there are only two ways of creating value. You can either essentially work out the why, you can discover what people really want and find a really clever way to supply it, which is ultimately the best way to do it. It's psychologically led innovation. Or you can work out what you can make and you can find a really clever way to make people want it. And there is no useful distinction to be made between those two things. And I would argue that almost every successful innovation requires both elements. Zoom, in the case of Zoom, nothing changed technologically or economically about Zoom between January 2020 and April 2020, okay? What happened was the conditions changed so that its widespread use was widely accelerated. And people then, after Zoom, after the pandemic's over, people will continue using it, okay? What Zoom had in January 2020 was a behavioral problem. They didn't have a technological problem. They didn't have a pricing problem. And so the problem they faced was really a problem of network economics. It was partly behavioral economics, but it was partly network economics. How on earth can we get people to do things the same way? Now, interestingly, before the pandemic, I met the marketing director of Zoom, who's wonderful, by the way. And I had two flippant suggestions, which I winced at. I said, the way to solve this problem really of widespread adoption of remote working and remote meeting is you need a major transport strike or a minor pandemic. And I kind of wince every time I think back to that. That was summer in 2019. And I kind of get a little bit of sick comes up in my mouth. I'm sorry to have to tell you, but I'm in the spirit of honesty. I tell you that story. Okay. But the second thing I said was, look, what I would do is you need people to start using this simultaneously, because mixed meetings don't work very well. So why don't you create the concept of Zoom Fridays, which is on Fridays, everybody in the team works from home and they all meet up by Zoom. And so Zoom Fridays, if you think about it, behavioral change programs in public health make big use of this. You have Movember, Dry January, you know, everybody quits smoking at the same time, everybody quits drinking at the same time, everybody, you know, if you get people to do things, religion, going back even further, which is a form of public health campaign, in a sense, the Sabbath is simultaneous. Lent is simultaneous, Ramadan is simultaneous. You create these collective behaviors because that's how you solve network problems. It's difficult to get people to all abstain from things if half their friends aren't doing it. It's also hard to spot who's breaking the rule, by the way, as well. And so Zoom Fridays was essentially an attempt to solve a network problem, which it would never have worked as well as this did, but it might have worked. It would have worked much more slowly. But that's my point, which is, I'll come to this in a second, that marketing is a branch of economics and that we need to study every form of heterodox economics that's out there. And I'll come to this in a second. Innovation and marketing have one thing in common, which is that economics doesn't understand either of them. Marketing and economics are both completely, marketing and innovation are both completely exogenous to economic models, which assume equilibrium, a constant sort of supply. You know, essentially, they assume that perfect information and perfect trust, hence you don't need marketing in that model, because marketing would have no effect if everybody had perfect information and perfect trust. Okay, and they also assume that no innovation is happening. Innovation is something which simply, like marketing, descends on their model from outside. And just as Paul Romer effectively got a Nobel Prize for economics in what you might call endogenous growth theory, which is models of economics where growth and innovation are part of the model rather than external to it, you might argue that Richard Thaler got a Nobel, or Daniel Kahneman kind of got a Nobel Prize in marketing growth theory. Okay, you know, theories of economic change where psychology and marketing are not external to the model. Okay, so in an interesting kind of way, I've got this strange pop-up, I'll move slide, there we go. Mainstream economics ignores innovation and it ignores marketing. And this is a comment, this is obviously a long-standing problem, because Roe Anderson in 1957 wrote that, I've just got to panic because I have got a meeting at 12. What is needed is not an interpretation of utility created by marketing. You could use the word value for utility, but a marketing interpretation of the whole process of creating utility. Now, I would argue to Mr. Anderson, who probably isn't alive anymore, that Austrian school economics was trying to do that. Okay, the economics around von Mises and on human action was trying to create a psychologically led interpretation of the process of value creation. Marketing only understands value creation through the lens of efficient production of goods that people already want. And as a result, the only way you can improve well-being in marketing is to produce more stuff or to produce it at a lower price. Okay. And as a result, most businesses are disproportionately focused on efficiency. The problem that creates is it only gives you two levers you can pull. So marketing is not just wrong, it's also hugely creatively limiting, because it focuses business on completely the wrong thing, which is, you know, efficiencies of production, price reduction, or material improvement in objective qualities of a product, not on more neatly hitting the spot in terms of a human's deep felt needs. And I say deep felt because they're not thought and they're not spoken. Marketing is a branch of economics. It's the science of knowing what mainstream economics are wrong about. As a marketer, anything that's heterodox economics, and I include all of these, is of interest to marketing. Because if marketing is if economics is a model of the world without marketing in it, anything that criticizes economics is of interest to marketers. Okay, by the process of what you might call reduction. I'd also include Marxism in that as well. Go on, why not? Drucker never said what gets measured gets managed. Scientism causes and the perverse role of economics. Drucker never said it. He's an Austrian school economist. He never would have said something so stupid. Austrian school economists are very skeptical about quantification, because they argue that as exactly as we said earlier, that actually what counts doesn't, in other words, what counts, you can't count what counts. That's the basic problem. And it comes from a criticism which says what gets measured gets managed, even when it's pointless to measure and manage it, and even if it harms the purpose of the organization to do so. Dysfunctional Consequences of Performance Measurements is the title of that talk. What business loves to measure because it likes artificial certainty. It likes pretending that business is Newtonian physics, or even simpler than that, to be absolutely honest. It likes pretending it's additive. And it measures money, and it measures objective reality. What people care about, this is from David Rock, are things which we don't have SI units for. Things like, I don't think this is a complete list, but it's a pretty damn good starting point: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. We therefore end up making decisions through the broken binoculars, which is economic theory on the one hand, quantification bias on the one hand, market research on the other, where we're talking to the amygdala, we're talking to the brain's inner lawyer, we're not talking to the brain's ultimate decision maker. We're talking to the legal department, we're not talking to the Oval Office. We're talking to the PR department and the legal office, we're not talking to the real source of decision making, action, and essentially what drives satisfaction. And so we need to follow Darwin. We need a science of exceptions. We also need to get rid of the Newtonian constraint where magic is impossible, because in marketing you can produce magic because we don't perceive the world objectively. And therefore, if you design for perception rather than design for objective reality, you enjoy a kind of magical power. This even applies to price. Price perception can be completely transformed by comparing the price of something to something different. And I'll have to close my call in a second because I'm off to try and perform a bit of magic with WPP's property portfolio. But Nespresso seems really expensive if you compare it to instant coffee. If you compare it to Starbucks, it seems cheap. The idea that $1 of expense creates $1 of pain is a total misunderstanding of human psychology, and it comes from the attempt of economics to cram everything into the single bucket of utility. Jag, I thank you for that. And again, marketing is the science of knowing what economics is wrong about. If your chief financial officer hates it, it's probably good marketing. And unfortunately, all I need to add is that the reason these magical billion-dollar companies exist is because either accidentally on purpose, I'd add Apple to this list, by the way, they looked or stumbled on the real why rather than the proximate why. They satisfied the real deep felt reason that people buy things rather than the official reason. Okay. And they understood that people's willingness to pay. There is nothing in Dyson I could add. I could add Apple to this list. I'd add a few other businesses to this list. What made Steve Jobs different is that every other mobile phone manufacturer was asking, what can this phone do? That's utility. What's the clock speed, the processing power, everything else? Steve Jobs asked an ultimate question, not a proximate question. And I got to end on this sentence because I'm sorry I've got to dash. What Steve Jobs asked is, what does this phone fit? What does it feel like while you're doing it? Not what can this phone do, but what does it feel like when you're doing it? And if you look to the first iPhone, everybody wanted them. Okay, everybody wanted the first iPhone, but the first iPhone was shit, right? There was no app store. So basically what you had on the first iPhone was a really, really luscious user interface that let you use a calculator and see what the bloody weather forecast was. That was it, okay? In compared to utility, it was shit compared to a feature phone, but it felt a lot better. And that's where I've got to end. I've got to go. I'm so sorry I've got to leave, but it's been a joy. Please send me the recording. And if you all want to follow up, I'm going to be here. So go and talk to Ogilvy in South Africa if you want more of this. We can happily work with them because we're not living in the world anymore. We're living in Zoomlandia. So all I can say is Ogilvy in Johannesburg and Cape Town is utterly fantastic. Go and talk to them first, but I'm totally happy to get involved. Thank you ever so much. And sorry to have to leave in such a hurry.
Thank you so much, Rory. It's been
It's
a
a
pleasure.
joy.
Cheers. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed. Do you have any questions, comments? Thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. It's been a pleasure. We've heard Mzamo and Rory. They've had a great session prior to Rory's lecture. Thank you very much. So I'm going to end it here. Thank you guys for tuning in. I've got a question here. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lee. Thank you for tuning in. Priceless. Awesome. Amazing. So it's been the Thinkerneur Institute of Strategy lecture by Rory Sutherland with appearance by Mzamo. We look forward to hosting more sessions that bring value to you guys. Thank you very much. Cheers.